It's very interesting. After my illness was diagnosed, I've had many dozens of former students come to me. And often they will ask me what advice I have to give them at this stage in life. And because Newman's vision of the fact that we have a work that is given to us on which the plan of salvation depends, I mean, he will say that God could give it to another, but in fact, this is the deep invitation in each of our lives that we have this great dignity. We're meant for a purpose which we can't fully grasp. So if that's true, then the main purpose in life is to be attentive to the working of grace that invites us to understand that work more deeply and to participate in it more fully. So I think that's the real key, because so often, out of goodwill, we'll often think, what am I called to do? But then we become concerned about a work. But in fact, what God is inviting is a transformation of life and its purpose, not simply a work to be done.
I'd met Dr. Briel by reputation, casually, very much in passing, kind of walking through Sitzman Hall maybe, early in my time in my studies. He loomed over the program as a kind of gray eminence, and his spirit sort of was inhabited, and people had stories about him.
So I went into his office and introduced myself. It was probably the first time where I met him officially, and he's a very dignified man, and I experienced his nobility immediately. And even in my conversation with him, I was so taken, because in the past, Catholicism for me had always kind of been cheesy, or nothing really substantial or noble or dignified. And here in this man, I found that there's a real dignity here. There was something great and excellent that I never had experienced previous.
My first encounters with Dr. Briel began going to daily Mass. My first impressions were of a man who was very collected, and his demeanor was always something that drew my attention, because there was always a calmness and a quiet, a focus in his presence.
It was gradual. I just kind of was immersed in Catholic studies, and thus immersed in a way in Dr. Briel's presence, and sort of washed over me gradually, and got to see him around, but there was no specific kind of flashy introduction or anything like that.
So Don Briel interviewed me for this job. Don always had a bit of a kind of a distant feel to him, but as time goes on, one warms up to him. And I will say, one of the things that one is taken by when one encounters Don is the power of the intellect.
I'm Don Briel. Since my earliest childhood, I would say, I'd had a deep sense of God's love for me and God's presence in my life. I remember even as a very small child going to a school at the mission in Mission San Buenaventura in Ventura, California. And I would always stop to make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament on my way out to the bus. So this was intense throughout all of my life. And then as I began my own formal education, particularly on the university level, and my encounter with Newman, whose vision that each of us has a vocation in life. We may not know it in this life, but we'll know it in the next. And then I began to seek to understand what that might be. For a long time, I thought it was priesthood. And when I discerned away from that, then it seemed to me that education, to be an educator, would be that primary way of service.
George Weigel says that when Don Briel started Catholic studies, it was one of the more significant moments in Catholic higher education, and I think Weigel's right. Don Briels don't come around very often. As I mentioned, he had a great vision about what this was about. Don was constantly trying to help us understand what are the habits of mind to help people see things in relationship to each other in order to make good judgments about the world.
It was partly my formation in Newman and partly my growing sense of the problem of the university. That is, So often now, I think students' experience of a university education is one that is fragmented and compartmentalized. They receive principally a technical education to prepare them for a professional field of study, but they don't have what Newman thought to be essential, which is an education which forms a habit of mind in them, which enables them to see the connections among things, to see things whole and to make judgments about it. So I became increasingly concerned about how we might, within a relatively large institution, create for students who were interested in pursuing this ideal an opportunity to do so. We tried a couple of efforts, including one which was attempting to link introductory courses in theology, philosophy, and English. But none of those efforts succeeded, and eventually I decided with a number of colleagues that we simply had to create a freestanding program that would be truly integrated, which would provide not just an introduction to the interdisciplinary character of thought, but also a formation of life and mind that would enable students to bring that to bear on their own lives and on the culture. It had, from the very beginning, a fairly strong vocational element, because to think deeply about the truth of things requires that a student think about his purpose or her purpose in life. And so we found fairly quickly a large number of men going into seminary and women into religious life, but also young men and women going into the professions, medicine, law, business, with a deep sense of its ultimate purposes. So they were not only technically well trained in those fields, but they had a vision of its deeper purposes and reality.
Catholic studies embodied this true view of reason, which is not about control, but about yielding and freedom to the evidence, about a relationship with the one who is truth. And in this relational encounter, the whole person, the whole human person is involved, including our imagination. Catholic studies and Dr. Briel really emphasized the importance of a Catholic vision of reality in all that we do.
So as I was walking out of his office, he said, "Now, you might want to consider doing this thing called Catholic Studies. It's very easy to double major." And he kind of talked me through what it was, and immediately my heart said yes. Like, of course, this sounds wonderful, because what I loved about the Catholic Studies program is the interconnected realities of the disciplines. So theology is a discipline, but really Catholic Studies was able to present the integrated whole. And Dr. Briel was able to present that to me in a very simple way, a very attractive way. And so I walked out of that room, really my life had changed and for the better, and I'm so ever so grateful for the ways in which he received me. And I think if he hadn't received me in the way he did, I don't know where I'd be today.
Once you start to get around the campus and you're hovering around Catholic studies, his reputation precedes him. So I'd heard that during a seminar, his seminar on Newman, that he realized that no one had really come to the seminar that day prepared to discuss the reading.
We showed up one day for class, and I'm not sure what happened that day, but most of us hadn't done the reading. And Dr. Briel starts to ask us questions. People are giving indirect answers or not responding, and it's starting to become clear that we haven't done the reading. And Dr. Briel packed up his books and said, "Okay, class is done for today." And that was it. But I think what it speaks to is that Dr. Briel didn't want to baby us, but he actually saw something in us and encouraged us to be mature adults and called us to a higher standard. This was a hard moment, but this helped set the tone for we're serious about learning, and he believes in us and wants us to aim for greatness.
So in the university, we tend to specialize, and the specialization is a great strength, but it's also a profound weakness, because you simply dig deeper, deeper, deeper into the particular discipline that you're in. And the deeper the hole, the darker it gets. Even though you seem to know one thing really well, you've disconnected from these other things. And Don was always trying to draw people back out. Okay, specialize, fine, but we have to find ways in which to connect that knowledge to other forms of knowledge, because then light begins to occur. And so his fundamental principles in Catholic education were twofold. One, the unity of knowledge. We have to provide forms. We have to provide ways to see the unity of knowledge. And second of all was the complementarity between faith and reason. Because the unity of knowledge is a deeply theological, religious principle. And thus we have to see that relationship between this 2,000-year tradition that we have developed and its relationship to reason that's continuing to move forward.
We see these as isolated issues. So one might pursue truth in a kind of technical sense. One might have an idiosyncratic or subjective view of beauty. And the problem of goodness, of course, now is that it's become so subjectivized. We've lost a deep sense of conscience. So to understand any of these principles, you need to understand their fundamental interdependence and relation. And this is certainly the case of Catholic studies. The question of beauty becomes very important in our own time. And the attentiveness to beauty, for example, in not only the studies that students pursue, but the world we try to create for them and shape for them, whether it's Sitzman Hall or the Bernardi campus, or why we want them in Rome to take an art history course, which introduces them more deeply to the penetration of grace within the material order, the material world, and the transformation that provides.
He was always the one who was illustrating the power that knowing the world from a Catholic perspective was going to bring.
Senior year, it's time to slough, right? So I took Psych 101 and, just all these really kind of low-level classes. And he called me into his office and he said, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "It's my senior year, come on. I've worked hard all this time. It's time to just kind of take a break." And he said, no, it's time to excel. It's time to apply what you've learned. Now is the time to really go after the truth ever more fervently. And so then I kind of complained. I said, "Well, great, but I don't really have any classes to take because I'd already taken all these upper level classes." And he says, "Great, we'll take master's courses for undergraduate credit." So this invitation was always to something more transcendent. And I really take that experience with Dr. Don Briel as really a lesson for life. When you kind of feel like it's time to sit back and relax and kind of enjoy the fruits of your life, if you will, at some level. It's like, nope, now is the time to rise up. Now is the time to keep going. Now is the time to keep being given and to give that encouragement to others.
The last time I spoke to Catholic Studies students at St. Thomas in the spring of 2014, I said if I had to tell the story of Catholic Studies, I would do it in the English translation of the 2 volumes of Raissa Maritain's memoir, Adventures in Grace and We've Been Friends Together. I think my experience of life has been, for as long as I can recall, a graced experience. And by that I don't mean a comfortable experience, but that I always felt Christ's presence in my life. And from that have come the deepest friendships of my life, because I have been given the grace of meeting so many good men and women whose vision of life both complemented and retranslated that sense of purpose.
Paul VI often says, we don't need teachers, but we need witnesses. And if we have teachers, they need to be witnesses. And Don embodied that. He witnessed his faith, both as a teacher, as a scholar, as an administrator.
He seemed to be attentive in a deep and profound way to what was before him in the moment.
Here's this man who's lived a life of faithfulness and knows his death is coming and knows more or less the timeline and has time to prepare for it. It made me think about my own death. And one thing that Dr. Brill always pointed us to was one of Newman's poems. It's become a hymn to lead kindly light amid encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. Dr. Brill lived that, and I think that's the only way we can face death, is trusting the Lord to be the light that leads us even in the darkness, even in this kind of leap into the unknown where we surrender ourselves into the Father's hands. So I felt very connected with him, even from a distance in that time.
All I felt in my heart was, could I just have 10 minutes to express to him how he changed my life, how he has shown me the way to heaven. So a friend of mine was going to see him the next day. He was going to go and offer Mass for him. And I just said, do you think I could come with you just so I can say thank you? And he said, let me ask him, but I'm sure. Dr. Brill said, of course, come. So in the midst of being able to celebrate this beautiful Mass in his home, he was very frail, but still able to engage conversation. we just sat, and I just was able to share with him just how grateful I am, and his place in my life, and the ways in which my whole life has been changed, and my community, my sisters, and all of my friends, their lives would not be the same if he wouldn't have done what he did for us in Catholic studies. And I said, if you need help, we would be happy to help you if you want to die here at your home. So that last month, we were able to help facilitate visitors with him who wanted to come in from all over, really, who were coming to see him. But then also the last few days where really we just sat at his bedside as he surrendered himself to God. And I had the great privilege of being with him in those last moments, all of his family and priest friends who were there. And it was really a very holy death, and one that we could all just hope for ourselves. The presence of the church around him at his side as he really gave his last breath to God.
To lose a touchstone like that is often to be thrust a little bit into a situation of insecurity. I mean, you realize how much you've depended on someone's knowledge and presence, and now, when he leaves you, you realize a ball has been passed, torches of responsibility has been passed. I was looking forward to a little more time and help carrying it. So it's a great loss to the church.
And as he mentioned in one of the articles that he wrote, that he thought his life would be a more contemplative ending, but it was actually a very active ending, because so many people wanted to see him. I mean, people from the world, people came from Europe, all over the United States, just to see him one last time. And the beautiful thing is he opened himself to that gift, even though probably his preference would have been more contemplative, quiet prayer, but he was called to something different. Similar thing. He thought he was probably called to be an academic, but actually he was called to be an administrator, to lead this project. Because if Don did not move into the administrative role, this project would have never happened. And in a similar way, if Don did not move into the active role at the end of his life, he would not have had that beautiful experience with all the people who sought to see him.
A young man came to me a number of years ago who was entering his senior year. And he spoke about the fact that when he was a freshman, he had been a physics major. He was assigned by mistake to the Catholic men's floor in one of the residence halls. And he was sort of, as he described himself, fairly lazy about it, and didn't make any initial attempt to move, although he had no intention of staying. But he looked at these young men on the floor who would get up and go to Mass together, and they were full of a certain kind of joy that he'd never encountered. They had a deep sense of their purpose in life, and they had a sense of friendship which arose from it. And eventually, after a few months, he said, I'd like to be like that. I want to be that kind of man. I tend to think that when people speak about joy today, they mean a kind of basic level of satisfaction. What I think the Christian means by joy is a kind of fullness of life. What he admired in those other young men was not that they were happy in some superficial way, but they had come alive. There was a depth of their experience of life. And so this is what I think Catholic studies has evoked. It's certainly what I have experienced in life through the friendships that have marked my life, and those teachers who disclosed to me what I might have intuited but could not possibly have developed without their assistance. So the joy in my life comes back to that sense that I was given a purpose, I was given a work, and that, of course, it was not my work as such, it was Christ's work, but to be able to have experienced that and to have observed its impact has been, a tremendous joy of life.